This is Dylan Moore with iRead TV. The following is an interview with Dr. Zachary Porcu, author of the book Journey to Reality. This is a book which explores understanding the Orthodox Christian worldview from the perspective of the secular, modern, Western mindset. Now, I don't think it's controversial to say that the West recently has been experiencing a crisis in meaning, and I also think it's difficult to overlook the fact that there has been a surge of interest in the Orthodox Christian Church in the West, if not specifically the United States. Now, this is a religion that historically is quite alien to both the Roman Catholic and the Protestant outlooks or worldviews, and of course these are the two major outlooks of Western civilization itself. Now, having been up Protestant and also having subsequently rejected it, then spending most of my late teens and the most of my 20s heavily involved in Shinto of all things, I have been, we'll say, pleasantly surprised or pleasantly shocked at how coherent the Orthodox worldview seems to be, or at least as much as I've been able to consume information about that worldview. So that said, when I read Dr. Porcu's book, I was very impressed at, again, how coherent and how well he was able to argue from the standpoint of secular language and secular perspectives. And I was so impressed, I said, hey, I have to get this guy for an interview. So I sent him a message and I set it up, and I was able to talk to him personally about the ideas that he brought up in his book. So without further ado, here's the interview. I'm sure you are going to enjoy it. I've got a very generalized blue sky first question, which is, how do personal worldviews affect how we interact with the world, how we interact with reality?
I mean, how do they not, right? That's what a worldview is how do you think about the world? It's not what sort of beliefs comfort me, or what would I like the world to be like, or what can I believe so that I can stop having anxiety and go back to watching Netflix. It's a worldview is the most serious thing that you have. It's the most important view that you can possibly take, because it informs everything about, not just about the grand cosmic moral questions, but all the way down to how do I even think about basics like physical reality or medicine or anything. So in the text, I say, religion is not a consumer choice. It's the answer to the question, what is ultimate reality?
And I got to push back right at the beginning here, because you said a worldview isn't, whatever I like in order to make me feel better. However, I think you'll agree with this. There's a lot of people with the worldview that, well, I want my worldview to make me feel good about whatever I'm doing so I can go back to watching Netflix, right? And I think you also mentioned this in the book, that you can't be neutral in your worldview. And there's this massive, massive attempt, I would argue, in the secular world to claim that, hey, we're being neutral. Is there a religious assumption in someone attempting to say, hey, I'm being neutral with my worldview?
Well, you can't have a neutral worldview because you can't have a view from nowhere, right? The attempt at a neutral worldview assumes something like a God's eye view, actually, weirdly, because your view is from you. Like, how do you look at the world from any other view than from your worldview? Which is why a lot of people last century concluded that everything was subjective, but that's another topic.
I love that conversation too.
Yeah, we'll get to it. Yeah. But you can't have a view from nowhere. You always have to have a view from somewhere, and that's not a problem. That's not a problem at all. But the attempt at neutrality is really this kind of subversive attempt at being right before the argument even starts.
Would you say it's manipulative?
Intentionally or unintentionally, it's unfair. It's what philosophers call baking the question, where you assume the conclusion as one of your premises. And this is what secularism does. It says, look, there's only the physical world. We can only prove the physical world, and that's the only empiricism, what is called, is the only valid way to know truth. So where is the man in the sky with the beard? Neil deGrasse Tyson was asked, I saw some stupid clip where the interviewer asked him, why don't you believe in God? He's like, well, we've been exploring outer space for about, however long. And we haven't run into the man in the sky with the beard. And I was like, you don't even know what we're talking about, dude.
I looked in my closet and I didn't find him. So right.
Where's God? I can't see him. It's like what all of that is based on is this assumption that the only valid knowledge is a certain type of materialist, empirical, etc. Right? So to say that that's somehow neutral is actually to assume a worldview into your methodology, and everybody does this. It's normal, of course.
And so, could you define secularism in terms of the way you have it in the book and for this conversation?
With the proviso that it's a complicated term in the sense that it has had many uses over the last 2,000 years, whatever. But what I mean by it in the text, and what I mean by it for the conversation about worldview and culture and Christianity, is the idea that you can run society without reference to any religious view of the world. You can have a religiously neutral view of the world. And so the type of government that comes out in the 20th century, from modernity, it doesn't come out fully in the 20th century, but the 20th century is like, it starts with the Reformation, the Enlightenment, all this stuff. But by the time we get to the 20th century, it's on full display in something like the Soviet Union, which is the secular nation state. And ours is too, North America, secular nation states everywhere in the West. And what that means is we're going to build a state. We're going to try to run society without any reference to what we perceive to be religious claims. And there are many problems with this. First of all, it doesn't work. But second of all, it's an unfair playing with these definitions, because you think, well, what's religion? And you have to define that. And that you can just define that as any of the things you don't like, just like the new atheists do, like Sam Harris and all these guys are like, okay, well, that's all the things we don't like. And all these other things, just like regular meditation and neutral spirituality, well, that's not religious, that's just spiritual or something, right? So these definitions don't even, they're whatever you want them to be. And so in the text, I say, listen, let's not use the word religion exactly. Let's call it what it is, a worldview. Everything is a worldview. Sovietism is a worldview. Liberal democracy is a worldview. Atheism is a worldview. And Christianity is a worldview. So secularism is sort of this project of running society on paper without reference to the religious, but in actuality with a very, very specific and clear worldview that it's just disguised under the auspices of being neutral. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting you brought up the Soviet Union and how this stuff these ideas started baking in like the mid 19th century and really came out on full display in the 20th century. And one of the things, as I've been myself on my own journey exploring these ideas, have really appreciated, and I think you really made this point clear in one of the presentations you did on your YouTube channel. Can you say something to the effect of how, even in our supposed secular worldview, how many traditional Christian assumptions are just taken for granted?
Oh, yeah, all of them. So many. So this is such a bizarre thing, because modern secularized people will have this idea that they want to be anti-Christian, and that they spit on the Middle Ages and, age of faith, all this stuff is stupid. They don't realize that the entire fabric of Western civilization is built on Christian ideas. And what I mean by that is these are ideas that not only did not, but I would argue could not have existed in the pagan world prior to Christianity. So let's give some examples. One is the concept of human rights that we so cherish and everyone's beating the drum about all of the time and trying to reappropriate for whatever agendas they have. this concept is not like human rights is not really a Christian concept because rights are just kind of artificial. They're very clearly constructs. But where does that idea come from? It comes from this idea that everyone has inherent human dignity. Now, why on earth would you believe that? If we went and asked a pagan Roman that, he wouldn't have disagreed with us so much as he would have found us ridiculous or insane. It's obviously a joke.
What are you talking about? He's a slave. Yeah.
Not only that, but it was obvious to them that certain sorts of people were just worse at everything. They were dumber, they were weaker, they were less courageous, they were cowardly, and certain entire races were that way to the Romans. So the Romans encounter people group and they're like, oh, that's clearly a slave race. Look at them. There's no argument there. And this is for anyone who's offended by that. Like, I really want you to think about how there's no reason to think that anyone has inherent human dignity. Where on earth would that idea come from? Some people are just weak and useless. Now, Christianity says that's not a problem because we all have our inherent radical human dignity in Christ. Our identity is in Christ. And so when Christ joins human nature to divine nature, that radically lifts up all human beings, regardless of anything. That's why St. Paul says there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, but all are one in Christ Jesus. That's one of the most radical things that I think was said among many other radical things by the early church, because it turned pagan culture on its head. They were like, well, what? Of course some cultures are better than others. And of course some people are better than others. It makes no sense at all to the pagan mind, which was brutally practical. And they didn't care about human life at all. They just crucified people like eating popcorn.
Mm-hmm.
It was no reason to, or no reason not to. So human rights, that's a big thing. But also, and this will turn the secular audience on its head, reason, our very specific approach to reason. So think about it like this. If you're a pagan, you live in the pagan world, and you want to go do investigations of all this kind of stuff. Plato, Aristotle, they did all that kind of thing. But as a culture, as a pagan culture, messing with nature is not really your realm. It's the realm of the gods. So think about Icarus flying too close to the sun. There's all these myths in the pagan religious tapestry where the moral is something like, keep your head down and know your place, mortal. Don't steal fire from the gods.
What I was just thinking of. Yep.
And bring it down to man. You don't mess with the cosmic order. You know your place. And we can talk about this if you want later, but I think that the reason that the pagans believed in the gods is that they encountered them. They encountered them and they were destroyed by them in various contexts or oppressed by them. And so that means that the realm of nature is a difficult realm to just go investigate. You would never have this modern scientist idea that we're going to subjugate nature for man. Like that's like very impious, actually, from a pagan perspective. Now, all this changes when Christ comes. What does he do? He vanquishes the old gods because they screwed up. They fell. There's a whole fall of the gods idea in early Christianity and in the text of the Bible. Christ kicks them out. And then man rules the earth instead. So I don't know. There's 12 Olympians and then there's 12 apostles. There's something going on there. So now the earth is conquered by Christ, who is the Logos, who is reason itself. And so when Christendom sprung up in Europe as medieval culture, they invented the university system, unity in diversity, because the idea was we are going to organize all knowledge under one umbrella on the assumption that the entire universe is the product of a single rational mind. So it's rational, it's understandable, it's clear. That rational mind, the mind of God, also loves us, so we can make these investigations, right? It's a totally different worldview about knowledge and reason and science, and it allowed for knowledge and reason and science to flourish. Literacy, scientific advancement, the university system itself, all products of Christian civilization, not of pagan civilization, as in the same way, to the same degree or the same extent that we often think of it as.
Well, and then it's funny. I mean, again, we're comparing like these secular people who are thinking that they're anti-Christian or some anti-religious or something along that effect, and they've assumed human rights. Like you said, the concept of rights is this more modern Enlightenment idea, but it obviously rested on this idea that we're all created in the image of God. Therefore, at some level, we're all equal, right? In the pagan Roman world, like you just said, it's like if I can subjugate you, you're now my slave, and I'll prove it. Right now, right? I'll subjugate you right now. You're my slave. What are you going to do about it, right? And so, this idea that people were equal was, in any sense, would have just been like, I think not just weird, but just like absolutely offensive, particularly to the ruling elite of, I mean, in this case, Rome, but probably any aspect of the world. Like there was always some ruling elite that did its best to enslave whoever they could for their own personal material benefit. And for this idea to come along to say, no, hey, we actually shouldn't do that because we're all equal. I mean, talk about absolutely revolutionary. And now we're to the point in the modern Western world where we just assume that's true and then turn around and say, oh, yeah, but, screw all this religion stuff that's, old and from the past. And I mean, just one that always gets me, I think this is funny, is if you really reject all religious outlook, are you going to get married to more than one wife? Right? Because that was also a Christian idea, right? I mean, for most of the world, you could, gather as many wives as you possibly could, subjugate, kill the man and steal wives.
Even the great Old Testament guys.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, again, listening to it, like I had an idea of it, but listening to that presentation that you made, or I don't know if it was a class, if you had people in the room or whatever it was. I think it was a pretty old video. Just this idea of how radically transformative on a societal scale this, I'll use the word revolution, this Christian revolution was, to the point where even when we reject it, we're still taking a bunch of its assumptions because we can't even, they're just basic. They've totally permeated the society. And go ahead.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was going to switch to the next question. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say the more accurate way to, because this is right, but the more accurate way to say it is that secularism, I think if you were going to categorize it within the sort of genealogy of all worldviews, I would say it's a form of a Christian heresy, meaning it specifically takes Christian core worldview pillars and then removes some of them and adds some other ones, right? It's not a totally different religion. Like Shintoism or Hinduism or Greek monotheism, whatever, these are very alien worldviews to us, to modern Westerners. And they're compatible with Christianity in that you can missionize to those groups and you can say, here's the part that's true and here's the part that's not. But secularism specifically is a Christian heresy in the sense that it's built on these Christian assumptions, and it's only possible as a worldview in a post-Christian state. So that's why a lot of scholars call this a post-Christian era. We're not a non-Christian culture. We're a post-Christian culture, meaning we've inherited all these ideas and all this baggage from it. Yeah.
Well, speaking of that baggage, and this is leading to my next question, which is obviously, I mean, this is, I got your book here. This is obvious from the Orthodox perspective, right? When we're talking about the West, depending on what date you want to give it, let's give it the traditional date, was it 1054, just for the sake of argument. It's been split off from that for 1,000 years or so now, and in particular, when we look at North America, we've got this. I mean, the Protestant Reformation happens in Europe, but everybody flees to North America, where you can basically go out into the woods and no one will bug you because there's so much space. you can invent whatever you want. You can invent Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and you can just go to Utah where there's nobody and mind your own business. So, in terms of we're talking like Christian heresy because it's built on these pillars of Christianity and has moved away in some aspect. How do let's call it the modern Christians of let's just stick with the United States for now, really err in, this is how I wanted to ask it, in approaching, let's be specific, in approaching the gospel itself.
The meaning like the text of the gospel, or just the sort of the concept of the gospel?
Both. I would start with the concept. Sure.
Well, modern American religions are they're heresies, and I want to be specific about that in a technical sense. I don't want to be polemical. I'm not trying to yell at people.
Right.
Heresy comes from the same Greek word that the word eclectic comes from. So if you say, "Oh, I have a very eclectic taste of music," that means you kind of have a lot of random pick and choose sort of thing. And that's what a heretic is somebody who picks and chooses the parts that they like from the gospel rather than accepting the whole gospel. So I think that's even a very scientific description of what we see in the heritage of the religious traditions of North America, which is they have all taken this fabric and cut parts out of it and sewn on some parts here. A lot of these additional Mormon doctrines, or they've gone Unitarian. Unitarianism was a big deal in New England, so they take out the Trinity, but they keep the Mass or something. I don't know. So this kind of picking and choosing thing, your question's very broad because you're like, well, what's the problem with all of these different things? And the answer is that they pick.
You had a specific answer in the book.
Okay.
Question, well, but answered every. Yeah.
So they're picking and choosing, and they're reappropriating completely freely however they like. And the problem with that is that you're not taking the whole received tradition. You're instead deciding which parts you want and which parts you don't. Well, what's the assumption when you do that sort of method? The assumption is that me and my individual, either emotional or intellectual experience, have the capacity as an individual to discern truth by myself in a vacuum. That's sort of a quintessentially modernist Enlightenment Reformation premise. And it's not at all the methodology that the early church had. So they wanted to receive the tradition of the apostles. They wanted to take what had been passed to them and faithfully pass it on. Everything was about authority, not in the sense that you're not using your brain, but in the sense that I pass on my grandmother's meatball recipe faithfully, right? It's an act of love and preservation. And it's actually a continual process of me engaging with the past and moving it forward into the future. And that's just a very foreign way of thinking that we have today, because we have this concept of radical individualism. And we think that your opinion is the most important thing. And it's not.
Yeah. And then in the book, let me put myself back up here. In the book, you made a clear distinction at this point to differentiate between understanding the gospel and participating in it.
Mm-hmm.
And this was fascinating for me in that I was raised in a Protestant background, which I mean, even if it's so funny because it's kind of contradictory, because the family says this is the way things are, and then you go to church and this is the way things are, but then you meet your friend and they go to this other church and that's the way things are over there, and the individual my opinion matters is like so starkly in your face, right? And how do I want to phrase this? Despite the differences in everybody being on their own individual pathway, there's this heavy emphasis on understanding the Bible. You got to read the Bible. You got to go back to the Bible. You have to understand it. And if you're, there's something wrong with your life, you need to go back and read your Bible. Well, the Bible's a pretty complicated and not necessarily clear, especially if you start with the Old Testament, right? On, okay, what am I supposed to be understanding from this passage from Leviticus, right? And without a coach, that's one thing. But on the other hand, this leads to this idea that as long as I understand it, I could be saved.
Right.
And from what I now understand, particularly from reading your book, is that's really out of step with the tradition of Christianity.
And the tradition of like all of human history and every culture and religion up until modernity, maybe, question
Yeah.
mark. Because the big shift from the ancient and medieval way of thinking about the world to the modern way of thinking about the world, one of the major components is this idea that it's the mind, it's reason, it's belief and assent to different things that is the most important element of your religion or your whole life. Whereas if you really sit down and think about it, you know that there are so many things in life that you don't need to understand in order to do, right? You can, I mean, C.S. Lewis gives the example that people ate food and were nourished by it long before the theory of, digestion and vitamins
Right.
and modern day nutrition originated. We didn't need to know all those stuff to know that they say, eat this, don't eat that, and you're fine. And so, you can learn about that. It's not bad to learn about it. But modernity, and especially Protestantism and all these kind of religious movements, they think that if you can get it, it's an intellectual problem. If you can figure
Right.
it out in your mind, then you're the winner. I finally found, we get so many, I'm a catechist at my church, and we get so many catechumens come in and they're like, I finally found the right religion. And I'm like, listen, all you found is the foot of the mountain. You have a lifetime of climbing to do from here, because it's not about knowing only, right? You can know, and the example I always give is with working out or martial arts or whatever, is if you only know about how to do martial arts or weightlifting correctly, you're not going to get strong. You
Mm-hmm.
need to do it, right? So it's like, I believe all the right things about nutrition and exercise. Well, then I have to actually put it into practice and I have to do it. And even that's not the last step. There's the third step, which is, okay, if you do it enough, consistently and properly, then you become it. The whole point is to become a certain type of person. So in Orthodoxy, you want to become holy. You want to become a saint. And that means something like being the best athlete in the world in your soul. So it's all about becoming. Christ says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. It's not, and so knowledge is the first step, then action, then becoming. And that's really what the focus is. But all these modern religions, since the Enlightenment, everyone's obsessed with like solving mental problems. And there are reasons for that. I don't want to be too dismissive, but that is kind of the pitfall that I see.
Well, and I think you just mentioned it, is it's like that's kind of step one. You learn something so you can do something with it. If you're just obsessed with learning and learning and learning and learning and learning, you kind of, not necessarily on a religious topic, but I like to use the term knowledge addiction. That people just want to learn stuff so they can figure out how to learn more stuff, and they never end up doing anything with it, and it kind of turns into disability, for a lack of a better term, because they never end up doing anything with their knowledge. So can you connect that? I really appreciate this in your book, to the idea of the one and the many, and how Christianity is neither, or ascribes to neither.
Yeah, I can do that. I was trying to find this passage for you in Thomas Merton, since you were talking about, Thomas Merton is one of my favorite Catholic writers. He has a beautiful kind of mystical spirituality, whatever. He's abbot at Gethsemane. And he often puts things in a really orthodox way that I appreciate, but I can't find it right now. But he said, something to the extent of like, through action, like you love the truth, and then you put your life into action until you become the truth that you love. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this whole beautiful kind of dialectic. Anyway, the one and the many. This is it's going to get a little philosophical. Are we okay with this?
Oh yeah, we love getting philosophical here. Bring it.
Okay. Okay. So for those who don't know, the problem of the one and the many is considered to be one of these sort of enduring problems in philosophy across the board. Every culture, every religion, every major place where there were thinking people trying to work these things out. And the problem is something like this. How is it that there are so many things, there's a multiplicity of things, while at the same time there does seem to be a fundamental unity to things too, but there's this kind of contradiction to them. Are things, because you could break it down at any level. You say, well, I'm clearly a person, I'm me, or this is a cup, this is a cup. But when we examine it, it's made of all these atoms and structures, and then when you examine those, they have even smaller structures to them, and the whole universe is like that. There's nations, and we know what a nation is, and there's all these people in it. There's a culture, but it's made up of individuals, and so there's this confusion about how do you reconcile the fact that everything seems to be a multiplicity, but there is also sort of this unifying oneness to everything. And the Greeks thought of that as the cosmos, that there was this ordered whole to the universe. And so the part of the problem is if you go too far on one of these explanations, then things don't make any sense. So if you say, well, fundamental unity and wholeness and oneness, that's obviously the main thing. And that's what the universe is really about. Then you have to explain, okay, well, then how are there many different things? How do you explain the multiplicity if the unity?
Real quick, sorry to interrupt you. Can you give a couple examples, religious examples of what might a religion that might attribute itself to that idea?
Yeah, so Hinduism is a great example because it's a very old religion. It's an ancient religion that still exists and is still practiced and believed in modernity. It hasn't been secularized as a whole. So in Hinduism, the idea is there's millions of gods, and obviously there's billions of people, all this kind of stuff. There's plenty of multiplicity, but Hinduism asserts that fundamentally, at its core, everything is really one. It's all part of this divine oneness. There's this thing called Brahman, and we're all part of the one. And so the goal of religious action is to become enlightened, to realize that distinctions between you and me are illusions. There isn't really a me, there isn't really a you. We're all part of the one. And
the Atman has to meld with the Brahman or whatever the
I'm rusty on distinctions between Atman and Brahman, but yes, like there's this fundamental oneness to everything. And different pagan Greek religions thought that the universe was like this too. Plotinus believed that the one was just the one, and then all of creation emanated out of it, like oatmeal boiling over a pot, dripping down. And when it gets to the bottom, it's all cold and hard and crusty when it drips down the side of the stove. And that cold, hard crustiness is Earth, where we are. Anyway, so on that worldview, the problem is you explain how everything has this fundamental unity in the one. The problem is it means that people don't exist. It means there aren't really distinctions between you and me, or between you and a chair, because everything's part of the one. So we lose our individual distinctiveness. And then you say, okay, well, why don't we just say, well, everything is a radical individual? That's what a lot of modern secular worldviews assume, is that, okay, well, I'm definitely me and you're definitely you. We are not illusions. The distinctions between us are important because I'm me precisely because I'm not you, and I'm not this chair, and I'm not God. I'm me. And so you can embrace a kind of radical individualism, but then you have the opposite problem, which is that you don't have any unity for anything. And the example I give in the book is love. So on a worldview of the one, where we're all actually this giant singular cosmic being, the phrase "I love you," because there's no I, there's no you, that just is like the universe hugging itself. This is the example G.K. Chesterton uses. There's no distinction. So the I and the you don't make any sense. But on a worldview of the many, where we're all radical individuals, there's no love part. All I can say is I'm having this emotional experience of you. And I hope you're having the same or similar emotional experience of me. But, if you've been around the block, people don't always reciprocate feelings for each other. And so the problem is it's hard to understand what we truly share in our oneness that allows us to say something like, I love you. So Christianity, famously, although less well known today, solves this problem of the one and the many through the doctrine of the Trinity. So the Trinity is just like this complicated esoteric thing that people are like, I don't understand it. It's a mystery. Don't worry about it. There's all these bad answers to it. Excuse me. We all have this like post-Christmas get together cough. The Trinity provides a cosmic model for how oneness and manyness not only can coexist, but that they reinforce each other. So God is three persons, so you have the multiplicity there, and he's one essence. And he's so much one essence that we can correctly call him one God. But obviously there's three of the persons. And if you want, we can get into why that makes sense. But just for the who cares part, because I think that's what people really want to know. Who cares? Why does this Trinity thing matter? Well, because it solves the one and the many problem philosophically. And then it says, okay, well, now you have a model for how love can work. If things can be many but share an essence, then you have the I and the you, and you have the medium through which the love part can make sense. So I love you. You have all the ingredients there for that to make sense.
Excellent. Hold on. Bringing you back here. You answered that faster than I was prepared for.
I felt like that went long.
Yeah. No, well, now I wanted to connect that with what we were talking about before with understanding versus participatory, because I thought that was really an interesting idea in that, okay, on one hand, with the one, there's no subject and object. So like you said, I love you just turns into me hugging myself, versus the many turns into this idea of, well, we're just kind of these individual atoms bumping into each other, and whatever experience I have, hopefully it's this experience that you have, but who knows, right? There's no actual objective connection there, and this difficult idea to understand, like you said, the Trinity, as far as the argument that you made in the book, seems to understand or seems to give understanding to solving that problem. Right. So, on one hand, there's this singular essence, and this essence, I'm totally going to say this wrong. Please correct me. Springs forth these, three different aspects of itself or himself. And through that, we have both the unity and we have the many to, I guess, be able to have both an object or a subject and an object, right? A verb and a noun. And in order for us to really experience something like that, whether it's a connection with another person or a connection with God or the arche, which is what I want to ask you about next, is it's got to be participatory. Because, you're over there. I read your book. I understand your book. You're over there. But in order for it to really be for us to really connect, we have to engage in some sort of action and do it. Like you said, I can't get nourished by reading about nutrition. I actually have to eat food. And when I eat the food, I actually don't need to know anything about nutrition. So can you say something that or tell me something more about how the solution to the one and the many is really kind of what fills that gap between just understanding something isn't enough, you have to participate.
Well, real quick, I'm contractually obligated to correct the heretical language, which is that there are no.
I'll keep swinging up so you can correct it.
Yeah, it's not a problem.
Yeah,
the Trinity, the persons of the Trinity aren't aspects of the Trinity, and they don't spring forth either. So they are eternally present. The Son and the Spirit are eternally present with the Father from all time. Pardon me. And there aren't aspects. That's called modalism. So some people say, okay, well, the Trinity means that God has these different masks. He has the Son mask that when he's saving us. He has the Father mask when he's creating us. He has the Spirit mask when he's enlightening us. And he just kind of changes his roles. And that's also heresy. We can get more into it if you want later, but I'll answer your main question. So what is this? What is the participatory thing going on here then? Well, it's something like, it's actually connected to everything we've been talking about. So like the idea that there's no view from nowhere. Why is there no view from nowhere? Because only persons have views. You are an embodied person. You have a view from where you are with the webcam, and from where I am, we have our own perspective because we are our own persons. So it starts with realizing that knowledge isn't something just like, vacuum. It's a person. It's had by persons. And then truth itself is a person. This is part of the Christian radical revolution of all thought, is that when we talk about the truth, we're not just talking about like some abstract answer to a problem. What's 12 times 90? It's like there's an answer out there. It's somewhere and we have to find it, and that's the truth of that question. Well, Christ says, I am the way and I am the truth. I am the truth. He's not being hyperbolic. It's in the same way that when John says God is love. This isn't hyperbole. These are statements of being. So the truth is Christ. Christ is the logos where we get the word logic from. And so the underlying logic to the whole universe, the base code of the universe, if you will, is Christ's being. He sort of unfolds the logos, which is himself, to make the world. And that's why in the creed we say that Christ is the one by whom all things were made. So when the Father speaks the word, he's breathing, I don't know how you want to talk about it, creation into being through the logos, which is Christ. And so what does all this have to do with your question? You want to know the truth. Well, the truth is a person and you are a person. So now you have to have a personal relationship with the truth. And that doesn't mean, this is important, that doesn't mean I have my own personal opinion about the truth. That's what a lot of people want to say in secular society. What that means is you have to have a personal relationship with truth himself. You have to get to know him. That's how you know truth. So you don't even have, there's so many illiterate saints. You don't have to read the Bible. Like, you should read the Bible. You want to read the Bible. But you don't have, there are illiterate saints who never read the Bible. Now, they went to church and they heard the gospel preached. This is good. And it's essential. But studying is not what gets you there. That's just something in your mind. In other words, that's treating truth as though it were an abstraction, rather than realizing that truth is a person and you need to have a personal relationship with him. So one of the fallouts of this is that is that vices and sins make you a worse knower of the truth, because they screw up your ability to have relationships. If you're an anxious person, if you're an angry person, if you're a depressed person, if you're a jealous person, those things warp your ability to see the world as it is. And if you have a friend who's super jealous, let's say, it means you can't really be real with him, because anything good you say, he's going to be all jealous of you. And you're like, well, now I can't really have as close a relationship with this person because he's got this jealousy problem. And all sin is like that. All of us are like this. So we need to actually get rid of our sins, work them down, confess them, grow stronger morally in order to understand any truth. Like somebody asked me one time, is becoming a saint going to make me a better physicist? And I said, yeah, probably, because you'll be able to see reality as it really is when you become more real and you get to know him who is, he who is what we say in the liturgy, he who is reality itself, right? So it totally turns everything on its head when you say that truth is a person.
The reason I'm quiet is both because I'm clicking to get the cameras back and because I'm thinking, because that was a profound answer. Can you tell me?
It's a head trip.
Go ahead. It's a head trip, and at the same time, I mean, I've heard this spoken before. Somebody says something that's true. There's no proof for it, but like it changes like how your body is functioning just by hearing it, right? And I mean, I guess I have a theory on that, which is that like, your your thoughts and your body aren't like separate from each other. You can't think without your body moving. You can't move your body without thinking. And I think what happens when you get, for lack of a better term, I'll just call it good information, is that your body stops fighting itself. Because with bad information, you're grinding it against yourself because it's not accurate. It's not truthful. And if it's truthful, that grind goes away, at least partially. So I had a little bit of an experience like that right now.
Cool.
So tell me about the arche and why it's different, or the concept of the arche is different from this or that God in any particular religion.
Yeah, so something that I do in the text is I deliberately make an effort to get away from the word God in a book on Christian theology. And why would I do this? It's because, again, we're a post-Christian culture. And so when you say God, people have emotional reactions just by the word. We have so much baggage as a culture about this word. And we have so many, frankly, ridiculous ideas of what that means. So a lot of people in the back of their head have this idea that God means something like an omnipotent Santa Claus who sits up in heaven and he spies on everybody and he makes his naughty nice list, and then he's going to send the naughty kids to hell and the good kids to ice cream land, and it's just like, this is a complete nonsense, made up. I don't even know what to say. It's really an infantile picture of what the ancient world would have conceived of as God. So there were Greek monotheists way before Christianity, and many people all over cultures and time and space concluded that there had to be something that was the source of everything. Some said it was personal, some said it wasn't, but it wasn't a far off idea. And so I wanted to recapture that idea by using this term arche, which is a Greek word. It means beginning in modern Greek, but it's also the same word that the prefix for something like archenemy or archangel. It means primary, first, chief, and the main thing. And the arche, the way I want to use it here, means that thing which is being itself. It's the source of all existence because it is existence itself. Excuse me. And so the analogy I want to give is, well, let me contrast this, like you asked, which is when we say gods, that in a lot of the ancient literature, what we're talking about is not really that thing exactly. We're talking about Zeus or Thor or Amaterasu or whoever deity. And who are those creatures? Well, they're creatures, means they're created, same word. In other words, they're not being itself. They're a distinctive thing. Thor has a personality. He has a hammer. Zeus has a lightning bolt, whatever. And Zeus has his own agendas and his own thoughts. And the Olympians don't know the future exactly. So they do divination because they want to know the future. That's a weird thing for gods to do. Well, they're just superhuman entities. That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the gods. And the early Christians accepted a belief in these creatures because I think ancient people encountered them. You see that in the Old Testament too. And they rule the world. They govern it in a sort of stewardship way, but they're not the authors of the world. And in fact, none of them are all powerful. They're more powerful than us, but they're not omnipotent. And there's a bunch of them and they fight all the time, and you can kill them sometimes, So clearly we're dealing with a certain class of super powerful creatures. The arche is being itself. He is the timeless, ageless, spaceless, immaterial source of all being. And you can't point to the arche anywhere and say, oh, there it is. Like, there's a dog, there's Zeus, there's a chair, there's Athena. Where's the arche? So the example I give is, we all know life is real. I'm alive, you're alive. This plant is alive, I hope. If I walk into a park and I say, man, this park is teeming with life. There's birds and dogs and trees and everything. And you're like, you want to be a smart aleck. And you're like, what do you mean by life? Point to it. And I'm like, well, that tree is alive and that squirrel is alive. And you're like, no, not alive things. Life. where is it? And I'm like, I don't know, because all of those things have life, but they aren't life itself. So it's the same with existence. Many things have existence. Everything has existence. But nothing is being itself. Nothing is existence itself. And the idea that there had to be something that was existence itself, again, was basic to all of the great worldviews, religions, philosophies, and history. Many of them thought it was just a force, though. And some, like the ancient Israelites, said it's a person, although it's not clear to me that the ancient Israelites really knew what they were doing, what they were dealing with at various points in their history. But the early Christians very much said, listen, the arche is real. It's a person. It's a trinity of persons, actually. And that was radical. That was something that ancient Greek philosophers thought was scandalous to them, because they're like, okay, of course the arche is real. Aristotle called it the prime mover, etc. But it can't be a person and then become a man, like really become a human being. That's a complete contradiction. How can life itself, which cannot be in time or space, how can it become a person? And so that was part of the dialogues of the early Christians with the pagan Greeks. But I wanted to kind of return to that ancient scandal, because I want modern people to recognize that when we're talking about God and praying to God and worship God, do you believe in God? It's like there's a lot of trivial talk about it. We're talking about that thing which is being itself, that then became a human being and is drawing us all up to participate in his divine life, to become fully real. And that's something that most people have not been told about the gospel.
You have a way of ending your point where I keep thinking there's more coming. Okay. Why can't the arche just wave his hand and solve the problems of death and human suffering?
Because of this whole free will thing. So, if you want God, what a lot of people say is that God created the world in love. He wanted to, the Trinity is full of love. God creates in love. He wants us to be in loving communion with each other in him. But you can't have love if I put a gun to your head. If I put a gun to your head and say, you're going to be my best friend now, and you're like, this is not real friendship. It's coercion. So if you're forced to do something, then it's not real. It has to be free. And so God has to give us free will and really allow us to choose in order for love to even be possible at all. So the problems of death and evil, well, let's say evil to start, if you're not free to do evil, you're not free. Just end of the story. You have to be truly free. You have to be free to do evil. But that's the necessary prerequisite to being free to love. And death is kind of a different concept. It's the idea is if the arche is life itself, the analogy I use is the power strip, and the life itself is the wall socket, and you plug the power strip into it, you have power. But if you pull it out, then the power goes out. It's like you're not the arche. You don't have life in yourself. And so when mankind unplugs from God, then we die. That's kind of what the Genesis, one of the things that the Genesis account is about.
And then how does I know this is not the correct way to say it, and feel free to correct me. How does the existence of evil prove God?
Well, many people have pointed out. So there's this old philosophy problem called the problem of evil, and it states that the idea is that the existence of evil is, you can't both believe that evil exists, and it's hard not to, and also believe that there's a loving, omnipotent God. Because if he loved us, he wouldn't want to see us suffer, and if he's omnipotent, he could do something about it. And so therefore, if you have either God doesn't exist, or he doesn't really love us, or he's incompetent. That's why there's evil in the world. And this has been refuted so many times. I just don't know why it continues to hang on. It's refuted very easily with the free will defense. But the twist that you're alluding to that some philosophers have taken to it is that, well, actually the existence of evil proves that there's a God, or at least it suggests strongly that there's a missing element that can be filled by God. Because if you say something is evil, you're actually making a weird claim. You can say you don't like something. You can say something is counterproductive to your agenda, whatever you want. You can say, oh, that causes suffering. It's like, well, so what? It's like, well, I don't want to suffer. It's like, okay, like you haven't yet gotten at evil, because what we mean by evil is something that violates the cosmic moral law, you could call it, of the universe. So the idea of evil, not merely suffering, assumes good, and both assume a absolute standard, cosmic absolute standard for morality. Now, why would you assume something like that? It's like, well, it sounds like we're talking about God. It sounds like we're talking about a moral world that's transcendent and absolute of our material circumstances. Absolute and transcendent of our material circumstances. So that seems to imply at least some kind of moral lawgiver, right? Now, you say, well, then therefore not necessarily the Christian God. And it's like, okay, sure. But the point is, if you really want to say something is evil, and if you want to say something is good in a moral sense, then absolute morality has to be on the table. Well, absolute morality is what you're assuming, and then God is definitely on the table.
It has to be an absolute morality giver.
Yeah.
Yes, in some sense.
Yep.
So, going back to what you just said about the fall. So, part of the story of Genesis is that there's this disconnect from God, and that causes death. This is, correct me if you think this is a bad way to say it, Christianity is the solution to that. Was that a fair thing to say?
To death?
To the disconnection from God, right? Human beings disconnect from God in the fall, and then maybe I shouldn't say Christianity. Christ is the solution to that reconnection to be able to happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, in the absence of me being aware of Christianity, let's say I'm in the Amazon remoteness and a missionary hasn't come to me yet, or this is pre-Christian world and pagan wherever. Do you think that regardless of the religious worldview, that it's observable that human beings have disconnected from the arche? Like, can the argument be made without Christ coming and saying, hey, guys, this is what happened?
Yeah, that's not where I thought you were going to go. This is cool. Yeah, because everybody gets sick and dies. I mean, everybody knows, like, something is wrong with the world. Every single culture has some kind of origin of evil story, because everybody realizes that we have this sort of innate, almost godlike potential as humans to reason and to create and to do all of these things. But then we have this bizarre paradox where we get sick and old and die. And that something is wrong. Like, everybody knows this. Every single ancient mythology realizes that this is a contradiction. John Zizioulas, the late bishop of Pergamon, said that the fall results in the ultimate contradiction, the dying being. Right?
Dying being, because if I was dying, how would I be being?
Right. It's such a bizarre thing. And so, everybody knows there's a problem. And all these different worldviews have come to solve the problem in one way or another. And Christianity offers a solution. It's not that, like, without Christianity, I wouldn't know that there was a problem. Like, there's a problem, because death is horrible, and that there's evil. One philosopher put it this way. He said, he was trying to get away from all the arguments, and he just kind of stepped back and he said, listen, we know that the moral world exists in the same way that we know the physical world exists, because we bump into it all the time. You have a conscience that nags you. You do bad stuff and you see evil in the world, and you're like, we have this real, our experience of a moral reality is very obvious. And it doesn't matter that it doesn't fit into the sort of narrow empirical methodology that modern secular science wants to insist on, because most things don't. And in fact, all the things that have meaning in life don't fit into that. So you can either be a bad scientist and throw out 90% of the data of every single culture and human experience, or you can say, you know what, there's something going on here. There's a moral perception that we all have, and we know that something is wrong. C.S. Lewis pointed this out in Mere Christianity. He said there's two funny things about humanity, is that A, we all know that there's a moral law. Every single major culture has a set of morality. And B, everyone's aware that we don't really hold up to it. We have it, and we don't do it really. Like, sort of. And he said those two awarenesses have gone together throughout all these cultures. And he's like, isn't that weird?
Yeah, and then I'm going to expand on this question. And I've been waiting to ask the appropriate person this question because I've been sitting on this for a while. So if I take a kind of a world history step back and I say, okay, here's all this stuff that's happened since, we'll say, 5000 BC, and all these different religions and all these different places. And as I'm a pattern junkie, I guess, for lack of a better term. I'm obsessed with finding patterns and things. A pattern that I've observed is that religions really seem to fall into two different categories, which I'm about to explain. The first category is you're here one time, you got one shot, you're going to be judged on that one shot based on how you acted in this one shot that you have for the afterlife. The other category is you have an infinite number of shots, the endless cycle of rebirth. And not only do you have an infinite number of shots, they all suck, right? It's suffering because no matter how, like, okay, you're going to be judged when you die and you're going to be reborn based on what you did in the previous life. And even if you nailed it in the previous life and you get reborn better, and then you get reborn better, and you get reborn better, at some point you're going to screw up and you're going to go back down to the bottom, and it's going to be horrible. Then you're going to come back up, and then it's just a cycle that never ends. So there's even this like futility toward the idea of, having a certain, I mean, obviously I'm referring to the Hinduistic tradition here, having a certain karma, because no matter how good you are, you're still going to be stuck in this endless zoo loop, right? And the various Hinduistic religions, and I include Buddhism and Sikhism, for example, under this broad umbrella, because both of those attempt to address the issue of like this infinite suffering, right? And, the Buddhism solution is like, how do we just, or at least the early Buddhist solution is, how do we just snuff ourselves out? I learned that, is that nirvana literally means to extinguish or to snuff out. How do we snuff ourselves out of this, infinite suffering of existence? And if I look at these two as kind of like two banquet tables, and I guess a small thing, there's kind of a third banquet table, which is paganism, and I don't really include it because there isn't really a pagan tradition that attempts to have a cohesive understanding of everything that's going on, right? So if I look at these two banquet tables, Christianity has a solution to the first table. However, this works on the assumption is you got one shot, one time. Why, if I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to not understand but participate in reality, what worldview I want, why should I drift toward that you got one shot, one time versus you got an infinite number of shots?
Slight correction is that paganism, if you mean by like Western types of paganism, Greco-Roman,
I mean
Egyptian,
anything,
whatever.
Pre-main world religion.
Yeah. I mean, they would take either position, right? There were pagans who believed in reincarnation. There were pagans who did not. Everyone went to Hades, if you're a Greek, etc. So it just kind of, paganism is, there's just type. They're both paganism, I think. Yeah. So why should I pick one? It's like, well,
Well, let
maybe
me be a little more clear. Christianity offers a solution to one of those tables. What if I'm at the other table?
Yeah, well, so the answer is like, well, the thing you want is what's true. I mean, that's the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question, so the sort of the preceding question is, well, which of these is the actual state of things?
Correct.
Are we reborn or not? And I think it's really interesting that, well, okay, so let me say this. The early Christian take, as I mentioned, was not that the pagan deities did not exist. They accepted the existence basically of all these creatures. What they said was they are
Demons.
they're demons. They're fallen gods. So I don't know what you know about this, but the idea is that when God made the world, he put certain angelic beings, if you want to call them that, I'll just call them gods, to steward over different nations. And I think this is the subtext of what's going on in Babel, which is that when Christ divides, or God divides the nations, he assigns them an angel, a deity, and that deity gives them their language. This is what Origen says. He gives them their language, he gives them their customs, and he's supposed to watch over them. And God chooses Israel to personally watch over himself because humanity is in its infancy. So we all need these different creatures to, like, we need a divine patron to watch over us. So God takes Israel for himself and he assigns, there's something in Deuteronomy that says, you know, mankind was divided according to the number of the sons of God. He's talking about the gods, the angels. So the Christian narrative is that every single one of those patrons went bad and had his own or her own personal fall.
Every single one?
Every single one. That's the idea. And created, well, as the ones that were assigned to humans, to human tribes and nations. And they created the pagan religions as an elaborate falsification so that to trap their individual people group in the worship of their religion. So the gods were hungry for sacrifices. They do eat them in some capacity. You know, Moloch wants babies for whatever reason. It's like, so they created these essentially. So the pagan religions are false in the sense that they are elaborate propaganda narratives that do revisionism on what actually happened to entrap the people group that they're in charge of patroning, but then they get all the sacrifices and worship and rule. So this makes a lot of sense as a unifying theory for all world religions. That's kind of why I like Christianity from this kind of comparative religions perspective, is it offers a unified field theory for religion, if you want to put it that way. Because if you look at all these religions, so many of them have this narrative, like I'll pick on the Greeks, for example. The Olympians, you know, their parents were the Titans, and they screwed everything up. And there was a war in heaven, and we overthrew them, and now we're going to rule the world properly. And like, doesn't that actually sound like a revisionism of the actual narrative, which is that the gods fell and God, the arche cast them down from heaven, and wasn't, you know, it's not Saturn was mean and we overthrew him, and this is the narrative of people who lost trying to do revisionism to trick their human patrons. Okay, so why am I saying all this? Because if you accept this or find flaws,
sorry, just to make sure I'm coming up to speed here. So if we say Saturn is the archetype of the arche, he's an arche twice there. The archetype of the arche. And he supposedly devours his own children, and Zeus comes by and or his wife pretends that Zeus is a rock when he's born, so he eats the rock instead of Zeus. Zeus goes up, beats him up, and the kids come out and they take over, right? That would be a propaganda spin of Zeus and his siblings going, we just overthrew our dad, and how do we make it look good?
Basically, except according to the Christian narrative, they didn't win the war in heaven. They lost the war in heaven.
So they got cast down.
Right. And so they get cast down, and what do? Well, they come up with a narrative to show why to put them in a better light and to give legitimacy to their rule over the humans. So if you accept this kind of unified field theory, or you find it plausible, then we can, like the early church did, then you can go look at the reincarnation thing. And when I studied Buddhism, with Charles Jones, who's a, I guess he's kind of a big deal Buddhist scholar at Catholic University of America. And he pointed out that, because when you have that giant wheel, there's this like old pictogram thing of like Buddhist iconography. Well, it's got the wheel and it's got all the stages of reincarnation around it. I'm sure it has a name that I've forgotten, but it's basically like a Buddhist iconography of the cosmos and how it shows the cycles of rebirth, and it shows all this complicated cosmology stuff. But holding the wheel is, I want to pull this up here. So this is the Buddhist wheel of life. It shows all these stages of reincarnation. There's kind of there's parts in the middle here, and then there's the three animals. There's all this stuff, and then on the outside there's all these scenes from life and how life and death are all related and blah blah blah. So this is an important, the Buddhist wheel of life, very famous, many versions of it. You see it in Buddhist monasteries, all this cool stuff. Well, guess what else is going on?
Somebody's holding it, as you just mentioned.
Who is this?
Someone with skulls on her head.
This is Mara. Mara is the god of time, death, and illusion. That looks like a demon to me. So it's a weird thing that I've noticed doing comparative religion, is that these demons who have fallen, they really have this desire to be worshipped and known. They just crave it. You can see all his weird feet and everything out here. Mm-hmm. So Mara, he rules the wheel. That's what this image is telling me. Now, Buddhist people can come in here and say, well, actually, blah, blah, blah. I don't care about that for right now. I want to zoom out a little bit. What's the big picture here? Is that this thing that you're trapped in, who's running it? It's the devil. The devil has you trapped in an illusion. Time, death, and illusion. So to answer your question, it's like, well, is reincarnation true? Is it really happen? And I look at this and I'm like, seems like a scam, like at a very basic level.
Well, and to that point, I left this out when I was framing the question. In the description of samsara, right, this endless cycle of rebirth, where I was listening to a teaching company lecture on Hinduism, right? And this professor was trying to get the point across, because sometimes when Westerners, or call the Christian or monotheistic side of things, hears about reincarnation, it sounds like, ooh, I get another shot, right? They see it as something kind of positive, versus the suffering nature of it. And the point that this professor was trying to make is that apparently in some Hindu Sanskrit story somewhere, there's this kid talking to, I think, the god Indra. And at some point, the kid starts crying. And Indra's like, what are you crying about? And the kid points down at the ground. He says, you see these ants walking across the ground right now? He goes, yeah. He says, each one of these ants has been Indra 100 million times. And that, again, this idea, like at some point, even the gods are subject to this, going in and out of the cycle. And I think that really, like, this eternity of you're stuck in this cycle, and no matter how good you have it, you could even become a god. At some point, you're gonna be stuck going back down into the cycle. Well, that sounds like hell to me.
Correct. Yeah, and I think
right?
that absolutely. And so it's like, it's not, you have to zoom out a little bit from the particulars.
Yeah.
The Far Eastern Indian subcontinent version of the cosmos is sort of the same as the Greek one, in the sense that we are all trapped. It could be trapped in Hades, you could be trapped in samsara, but like man is trapped and subjugated. He is under lock and key to death. And that's why in the Revelation, Christ says that he's conquered death, and that he now holds the keys to death, because death was a prison and a jail. And I if you just squint your eyes a little bit, it's easy to see samsara as basically saying the same thing. Because like you said, It's not that you get many shots. It's that you're stuck. It doesn't matter like in what way you're stuck, how you want to conceive of that.
Well, and then you can be the best saint ever and get the best reward ever, but it's temporary. And at some point you're going to screw up and you're back down where you were before.
Well, the way Dr. Charles Jones explained it to us was that when the belief is that when you finally got reincarnated as a god in the highest of heavens, you basically just got to party for thousands of years. You drank and had
millions
orgies.
Of years, yeah.
Yeah, you drank and you had orgies and whatever, and you just lived this life of hedonist pleasure for millions of years. But then you used up all your karma, and so you got reborn in hell. And so then you have to start the cycle all the way back up. So you like hell is a place of suffering and torment, and you go all the way back up and you go all the way back down. And so the takeaway from that is like the pleasure is meaningless too. It doesn't matter. Like like there's suffering and there's pleasure, and they oscillate. There's life and death. Like none of these things have any meaning ultimately. And
like going back more to my original question of the two banquet tables, what it seems to me these religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, whatever, is they all have their different way of saying this is how we disconnect from this. And like that this is why I've never really been a fan of Buddhism. And I know Buddhism, like when you have the Theravada and it turns into the Mahayana, then it turns into what is the Vajrayana, they have a completely different interpretation of all these things. But going back to the original guys, the story, as I understand it, is that there's this hell that we're in, for lack of a better term, and you're stuck in it no matter how you act. Like you said, it's all meaningless. So the goal is to snuff yourself out, basically to annihilate yourself, which, I mean, even that sounds awful. Right? I mean, it's an awful situation with an awful answer. And I
think somebody asked.
I liked your answer that it's just here's a demon holding it all together, and they even show that. What were you going to say?
Yes. I was just say the Buddha, I think, was asked one time. There's like 800 million apocryphal. Who knows if he said this kind of stories? But one time was they're like, well, when you achieve nirvana, do you exist afterward or do you not exist afterward? And he never answered. He just sat there in silence. And the guy asks him again. He doesn't say anything. He leaves. He's mad. And the disciple asked the Buddha, why didn't you say anything? And he said, well, it was the wrong question. And the point being something like neither existence, it's a category error. Like when you achieve nirvana, you don't exist and you don't not exist. It's just something else that we can't even conceive of. And to me, this is actually the most cosmic despairing thing you could say, because you're saying something like every single thing that you experience in samsara is fake. Even the concept of your own existence and personhood, there's no truth to any of it. And that's really more what you're kind of dealing with when you face one of these religions that's ruled by Mara, let's say. And the Christian answer is, to the contrary, God makes everything good. And you know that intuitively because you have these moments of joy in your life. I'm not talking about pleasure. I'm talking about we've all had these kind of transcendent moments of joy and beauty where you feel like you're touching something real and then it passes. And so the Christian answer is that's not fake. That's a foretaste of what's coming. And this is the whole emphasis of Orthodox liturgy and the Eucharist and everything, is that real life is coming. You can get hints of it. Those hints are breadcrumbs leading you along toward reality itself. And we're a good world that's fallen. That's all. And it needs to be redeemed. Whereas Buddhism, these other religions, they're like, it's all fake. Even your concept of being. And that's like, okay.
Let's get a little more historical.
Here we go.
So when I'd like to kind of set the stage in terms of where I came to from this, right? I remember I took world history in high school. I never took a single history class in college because I I absolutely hated history after taking it in school, and I wanted nothing to do with it. And it wasn't until I bumped into people addressing history from a different mindset that it actually started becoming more interesting to me, and I self-studied from there. But I remember, so we're learning about ancient Rome or the ancient Mediterranean in world history. And blah, 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 the Republic, blah, 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 gets bigger, turns into the empire, and at some point there's Christianity, and it's persecuted, and then Constantine converts, and then, oh, boom, this Christian thing comes out of nowhere, and it spreads, and at some point there's this schism where they disagree over something so minor and stupid that nobody really understands it. And at that point, it's like we completely we just forgot about the East. Right. And then it all becomes the Pope, the Pope, the Pope, the Pope. And then even when we're not talking about the Pope, it's the Protestant Reformation, which is hyper focused on, like, we're just not going to do, we're defining ourselves by not being the Pope. Right. Like, even in not being the Pope, you're just obsessed with the Pope. Right. And we don't really remember the Orthodox guys until we get back to World War I, where, here's the Tsar who gets overthrown, and here's the issues and the mindset of the Russians at the time, and the Orthodox tradition has something to do with that. And the feeling that I got from my academic history, we should say, is, oh yeah, those guys, when it comes to Orthodox Christianity, right? It's like, oh yeah, they exist. I forgot about them, right? And what I'm leading up to is that, first, I guess it's kind of sad that was the teaching I got, although I guess it makes a little sense coming from the Western. I live in the Western world, right? But if you just look at the raw numbers in terms of how successful the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has been in converts throughout its, like I said, let's start at 1054 as kind of this arbitrary date, to get Roman Catholics versus what the Eastern Orthodox side has been able to get Eastern Orthodox converts. I think it's something like an order of 10, somewhere around, in terms of, there's something like 2 billion Catholics and 250 million Orthodox. I'm sure I'm not entirely accurate on that, but
I think it's just 1 billion Catholics and 250,000 Orthodox.
Okay, 4 times. Significantly more is the point that I wanted to make.
No, 1 billion Catholics.
Yes. What's that?
1 billion.
Yeah.
So it's a fourth.
Yeah. So why do you think the Roman Catholic side has been so much more successful in proliferating itself than the Eastern Orthodox side?
Well, I mean, there's been books written on this, right? So I'll suggest a few food for thought items. Mm-hmm. One is that the Orthodox Church was simply the church that underwent more persecution for more of its lifespan. So the Turks, the Ottomans, the Soviets, I mean, something that we do is we just die when the enemies come.
The Mongols. Yeah.
I mean, so Orthodoxy has just been a persecuted church for most of its existence, and it's not therefore mysterious that there would be fewer. And there's a lot of cultural elements to this, and Greek Orthodox under Muslim rule and yada yada. But I mean, I think that's a simple explanation. The other explanation is that I don't know if raw numbers
tell the real story.
I don't know if raw numbers tell the real story in a lot of ways, because it's like, something that the Catholic Church gave birth to that the Orthodox Church did not give birth to was the Reformation. And the Reformation is probably the worst thing that's ever happened to Christianity, or one of them, in the sense that it marked the end of Christendom, of Christian culture, and heralded the coming of secular nation states. And Christianity has never recovered from that, as Christian culture has never recovered from that. Obviously, Christ is triumphant. That's not what I'm talking about. So Christian culture has never recovered from this. And like those were problems in dialectic with what was going on in Catholicism. So, for a few centuries before the Reformation, there were all these reformer popes who were trying to do all these reformations within Catholicism, and at various levels of success / confusion, and things that even honestly that the Catholic Church of today doesn't really sign off on either. So it was a weird time. It was a tumultuous time, and there were internal problems that happened even though the numbers were big, right? So it's like the numbers were smaller in Orthodoxy, but we didn't have a Reformation or Vatican II or anything like that. So those are some answers.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then just to say something on the persecution side, it's almost fascinating is I think too kind of a word, but I'll use it. It's almost fascinating. So you look at the Turks or the Muslim invasions. Constantinople essentially holds them off, and they're able to conquer North Africa, and they start crawling up through Spain. But for the most part, they engulf the Orthodox side of things. And I'm not going to say that they peter out, but they're kind of stretched out at that point where the West can fight back. Then the Mongols come, and from my understanding, it's actually just a stroke of stupid luck that the Mongols didn't conquer Western Europe, that they were on the path to conquering Western Europe, and then Genghis Khan died, and they all had to go back to elect a new Khan, and they just never got around to making it all the way to Western Europe. So I guess thank God for that. But and then I guess probably even the worst of them all, which was the communist revolutions, which was, at least the Mongols, if you were left alive after they conquered you, would say, yeah, you can practice whatever religion you want, right? The Soviets were like, no, we want you dead specifically. Or not just Soviets, whatever communist state it was. So the fact that all three of those things missed the West, talk about a just triple stroke of luck. When I think about it that way, I almost feel bad isn't the right word. I'll just use lucky. I feel super duper lucky that I live in this corner of the world instead of the other corner of the world where everybody's just like constantly fighting and killing each other all the time. Just
survivor guilt.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There you go. So, turning that question into a little more, I don't know enough about this to say this is what I think the situation is. What do what's your opinion on that? I'd like to ask you about the situation, which is I've heard, and I can't describe numbers to anything. There's this idea within at least an aspect of the Orthodox side of things that we don't evangelize. Now, my opinion is it's kind of contradictory to the whole entire point of the religion in the first place, but could that have been a result from maybe not 2,000, but 1,500 years of having to learn to keep your head down?
I want to say one quick thing on the last one, which is people's like, oh, those guys. Well, maybe you've heard of the Renaissance, and yeah. I read a really compelling case that suggested that the Renaissance was basically caused by the fall of Constantinople, and all the Byzantine scholars went west, and they brought all these texts like Plato to the west, and it kicked off the Renaissance. And it's
this Neoplatonic mystic occultist people all showed up in Florence. Yeah.
And all over, and there were successive Renaissances and all this stuff because the Byzantines brought all their texts over. So that's a really big deal. But we. Anyway,
it was just Italian ingenuity that came out of nowhere, right?
I'm Italian. Yeah. I'm Italian, so I would love to take credit, but I just can't because they took the ball and they ran with it, and that's great. But that's not the same thing. Anyway, you can't just make Plato out of thin air. So back to your immediate question. Remind me, forgive me.
So it's an evangelizing question. Should or should not evangelize? And if it seems to me that we should, based on you can tell me if it should or shouldn't. And if the answer is should, and there's some people who think shouldn't, could that have been literally an effect of we've learned to keep our heads down after so much persecution for 1,500 years?
Yeah, the persecution is the elephant in the room that you have to address, which is when you've been living as a captured culture everywhere for a long time, it's like you don't have the same attitude toward like everything's great. I'm just gonna go walk down the street and talk to people. Like that's not the world that Orthodoxy kind of matured into. So what did it mature into? It matured into a world where what was most important is preserving the Orthodox identity at home, raising Orthodox children, this kind of preservation thing. We're going to keep the faith strong. We're going to keep it intact. And we're going to build this. I think it's very scriptural. Like you're going to put this lamp up on a hill and then people come to you, right? That's a totally powerful, if you want to say biblical New Testament way of doing evangelism. Is like, we're going to build this giant church. It's going to be gorgeous. And then we're going to build this beautiful community and we can do outreach. My church does tons of outreach, Project Mexico, homeless ministries, all kinds of stuff. But the biggest thing we do is we love each other. We forgive each other. We have lots of kids and we build a giant temple. And so people show up and they're like, something is going on here. I want to be a part of this. And I think that is not only valid as an evangelical strategy, but I've biased toward it. I think it's better than random street corner evangelism or like round up all the natives and dunk them in the water, because those things don't take. I don't know. You walk up to somebody and you're like, God, and they're like, yeah, okay, here we go again. This is not effective.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who are these guys that want me to convert? And, I was around a lot of Protestants in college. I went to a Protestant undergraduate. And there was this whole culture of like, you just got to find people who aren't Christian, be their friends until they convert, and then move on to the next group of people. And that's kind of gross. You feel manipulated by that sort of thing. Whereas what Orthodoxy offers is it's something that works. It is the gospel. It just works. And so you would expect that if it's the truth, that there would be a good culture built around it, that it would have fruit. That's what Christ says, know them by their fruit. So build a beautiful temple on a hill, fill it with people, and then other people are like, my life's depressing. I want to be there. That's great. That's what we do. We're not going around like rounding people up. Although that said, there are many Orthodox churches. I want to be a little critical here. There are many individual parishes who are still at some level, let's say, subconsciously stuck in the hunker down mindset of being persecuted, like a lot of Greek churches, because they were under the Muslims for so long, that they really don't have an interest in the outside culture. They want to build an internal Greek culture. And I think there's good to that, because if you're not growing the next generation strong with strong roots, then your religion's going to die. But the bad to it is when I've had so many stories like this where people are like, I wanted to become Orthodox, and they go up to the priest at this random parish and he's like, who are you? You're not Greek.
You're not Greek. Yeah.
Go away. And it's like, okay, that's totally not at all how we should be treating people. That's clearly bad and wrong. I understand historically why that happened, why that sort of tight intercultural kind of group mentality emerged from the persecutions. But that said, it's still a very good thing to put your roots down and build a big, beautiful temple.
What about a third option, which is you go to the synagogue during service and you debate everybody on the spot?
I mean,
it's been a while since I read the New Testament. Isn't that what they were doing in Acts?
Yes, but here's the difference is that okay, I'm going to get a little spicy now. Ooh. St. Paul was dealing with, well, first of all, St. Paul is an expert in Judaism because he's St. Paul, and
I'm sorry, just to put an asterisk on that. I wasn't trying to pick on Judaism specifically. I was making an allegory to the St. Paul thing. So apply that to any religion, my comment, but please continue.
I can do both.
Okay.
I like picking on everyone, because everyone can be picked on at least a little bit. I just picked on the Greeks. So Paul is an expert rhetorician, speaker, educated Jew raised in a a Greco-Roman culture. So he goes to the Areopagus, he debates the Greek philosophers. He goes to synagogue, he yells at the rabbis. It's like he's the man for the job. But also two things. One, that's the culture they had. They had a debating, speaking, rhetoric culture where people reasoned and argued and did all this kind of stuff. That's not really the culture that we have. You could say, oh, well, we have the internet. It's like sort of, but so much of the internet is like scroll, give me the dopamine. Algorithm show me only what I want to see. And that totally like handicaps our brains and our souls probably. So that's a totally different culture, and we need very different cultural strategies here. And maybe that involves some kind of debate format, but in certain modes, it's like you don't just go to Times Square and you get up on a soapbox and start yelling about stuff. You could do that kind of thing in the ancient world. They didn't have television, Mm-hmm. They had street culture and they were outside. They didn't have all these machines, right? That's not our culture now. You do that, you're going to look like a lunatic, right? So it's important to know about that. The other thing, now I'm picking on the Jews a little bit. St. Paul was arguing against a different religion than exists now, because modern day rabbinic Judaism is a post-Christian religion. It's very difficult to say otherwise. I'm not trying to be, too
no temple, no priesthood,
too
right?
depreciating. Yeah, but it's not really possible to talk about them practicing the religion of Moses if there's no temple. That's just not. It's a non-starter, and so the religion had to be changed. And scholars think there was a council called the Council of Janus in about 100 AD. I'm not convinced about the evidence for that, but it's a hypothetical council. And something had to have happened where they got together and reorganized the religion around the not the temple model, but sort of the teaching and preaching, reading the text, rabbi kind of model. So the synagogue model. So that did happen, and they abandoned the Septuagint text and whatever. So anyway, yeah, modern day rabbinic Jews are not really practicing the same kind of religion, and so it's in a lot of ways it's an anti-Christian religion. And so I don't know how much. All this was to say, I don't know how much success you're going to get going into the synagogues now. Although it's an important counterexample to the time, because at the time they were open maybe to this, but also just the whole culture, Jews or Greeks or whoever, they love debating and they love this kind of format, which we don't have anymore.
We could go into that a lot. I'd debate you more, but no. For the sake of time, maybe that's another conversation later. In terms of, let's go back to, obviously there is an increased interest in Orthodoxy in America, right? I mean, I'm an example of it, right? And one of this is me going back to some of the history books I've read, is when you look at the East and the West, in terms of Western civilization, and I think what we could call Orthodox civilization, let's say the center is kind of like somewhere between Russia and Greece sort of thing, right? That if we take a quick glance at it, it's easy to say, oh yeah, that's all Europe. And it must all be one civilization. But if you really look at the cultures of the two sides, they're pretty distinct. And I'm wondering, so we're in Western civilization, and we're in a certain iteration of Western civilization that's now secular, that has all these certain assumptions about Christianity, but they're with this Protestant viewpoint and all that sort of stuff. Is with this renewed interest in Orthodoxy, do you think there's, whether it's fundamental or more surface, there's what sort of tension with the Orthodox worldview is there with, I don't just mean the West as it is secular now. Obviously, there's a tension there, but the assumptions going all the way back 1,000 years in the West that, like I said, we say we're secular, but we have all these Christian assumptions, but a lot of them are papal Christian assumptions, right? Do you see any tension that would either slow down the growth of Orthodoxy in the West or start to bubble up where we go, okay, there's kind of this cultural issue that we need to address if we're going to move forward?
That is a wonderful question. And I think because it gets at the heart, not just of like, well, don't be Catholic or Protestant if you're going to be Orthodox, obviously. But, you know, as a Westerners, we have this problem where there's a lot of people who sincerely want to be Orthodox, but we're saddled with all these assumptions that go very deep in our culture because that's what worldviews do. Well, that's what cultures are, right? They're manifestations of worldviews. So you get belief systems built into you over just how you live your life over time, over generations. A good example is the smartphone by itself, I think, creates a worldview of hedonism, because the idea that I can get what I want immediately whenever I want it. Yes.
Can I warn you? You have one child?
Yes.
I have three. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I got to say this just to prove
please.
Your point. My kids get to listen to whatever music they want at any time, anywhere. And they get to see whatever video. I mean, obviously we're controlling it, but the point is, I make this request and boop, 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 we can pull it up. I make that request, boop, 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 we can pull it up. And I don't like this one, do the other one. I don't like this one, do the other one. And I'm like, I remember I had a CD. That's what I had, right? Or you could listen to the radio and it's stupid commercials. And they've experienced this. Like, live in Washington, we drive over the mountains sometimes. We lose reception in the mountains, and it's like, we got the CD here and we can turn the radio on. It's like all you get. And they can't handle it. And even like they can't handle a movie. This blows my mind, because you get into the movie and, movie, you got to sit back and start kind of, what's the atmosphere? What's going on here? And they're already like, this video is boring. I want a different video. And I went, oh my God, how do I get control of this? So just warning you. Expect that to happen.
Oh no, I'm so technophobic. That's a whole other conversation. Yeah. This is my phone. This is the smallest Android phone in the world because it's really difficult and frustrating to use. I hate using it, and this is a feature. So anyway, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, so it's like this is a great example, because so they have a culture now that's been reinforced by technology. There's a worldview buried under there, which is I should get what I want immediately because exactly. I'm the center of the universe. So there's a worldview assumption even in how technology trains us. So it's like, okay, well, what about all of Western Civ? Kind of what are some of the attributes of our Western civilization that make barriers to becoming Orthodox or to understanding Orthodoxy? And I think one of them is what I would maybe call logocentrism or something like that, which is that it's like rationally, like over rationalistic in a what you might call a left brain way. But I really just mean like a non-participatory way of knowing, where an abstracted, disembodied way of knowing. We're obsessed with disembodying things as a Western civilization. We want disembodied. It's not like this great king will lead us into victory. It's like, no, the system, the laws, it's disembodied. Or like, where is the system that's going to solve this problem and make sure this problem never comes up again? And it's like, well, there is none.
Autopilot. Sorry. Yeah.
The world is made of people. And so, so it's like, how is the church run? Well, it's basically run by clergy and old ladies. And you need good clergy and you need good old ladies to run the church. And if you have bad ones, then it's not going to run very well. And you may go through a generation or two or 500 years of it not running well because we had the wrong people being produced in the wrong way by the culture or whatever. So it's like, so embodied versus disembodied. We love the disembodied system in the West. We also treat knowledge that way. We want to know. We want to be certain. Where's the proof? Where's the evidence? And it's not that proof is bad in the sense that you should just believe things with no evidence or for no reason. That's obviously like insane. Yeah, that doesn't even make any sense. It's that you have to get away from this sort of certainty neuroses that the West has, where it's like, because everything's relational and personal. That's what it means that the universe is full of persons. So I give an example. I'm married to my wife. I don't have a certainty obsession about like, am I married to my wife? Like, does my wife love me?
Is there a peer-reviewed paper showing that I am married to my wife? Yeah.
Well, it's like, does my wife like, I don't stress out about questions like, does my wife love me? And now maybe that's because I have a good marriage, but you know, we can get mad at each other and we forgive each other. And we just kind of like, I don't even know what that question means anymore. That's a question for young people. Like, am I in love? Like, I don't know what that means, but I am one with my wife. We are one flesh. We have a family. We are on a team. We are us. And so like that participatory being oriented kind of emphasis is much more real and immediate and powerful than the detached, depersonalized, prove that you love me sort of kind of obsession with certainty. So personal, so embodied and personal versus disembodied and impersonal, and then participatory rather than like certainty neuroses. I think those are some of the axes on which Westerners, from Catholic thinking all the way through Enlightenment thinking, characterizes the West and may make it difficult to understand what's going on with Orthodoxy. Because people are like, what books should I read? But I'm trying to become Orthodox. I'm like, well, here are some books you should read.
Put the books down, yeah.
But I'm like, you can read these books, but here's the main thing I want you to do. Go to liturgy and vespers all the time, because your catechism is in the liturgy, because you need to be formed in your person. It's like, I'm not against reading. I do the academic stuff. I wrote a book, whatever. The main thing is the catechism in the liturgy, in the service. Your spirit needs to be formed by it. And if you get this situation where, I'll give one last example and then I'll pass it back, which is when I was growing up around in these Protestant circles, there was this kind of critical attitude people had towards cultural Catholics. They'd be like, oh, those guys are just Catholic because they're Mexican, or they're just Catholic because they're Filipino, or they're just Catholic because whatever. And like, they don't really know what any of this means. They don't know it. They don't read the Bible. They don't know anything. Blah, blah, blah. It's like, but a lot of those evangelicals who made these criticisms, like, I don't know, a lot of their kids walked away from the faith and joined different religions and did different things. Whereas it strikes me as more powerful and more pious that these, for example, Filipino kids are just like, no, like, I'm Catholic. And like, they don't know what that means, but they know they're Catholic and they are going to die Catholic, you know? So it's like, and they're going to raise their kids Catholic. And it's like, okay, that sounds like actually a much stronger faith, even if it's less of a literate faith, let's say, than somebody who like knows every answer or something and has an opinion on everything, but then like doesn't do it.
Well, and then going back to, I guess I had about 4,000 questions embedded in that one question, right? That was a pretty broad stroke. So just in terms of the West getting over its supposed need for certainty, right? I mean, I tried to make a peer-reviewed joke, but I mean, like, so many even scientific topics have been politicized at this point. I'm sure I don't have to give any examples to you, right? And you know, these conversations can very quickly go into, well, what's the proof of this or what's the proof of that? Well, here's the paper. Well, I don't believe in that paper because that's not good enough proof, and proof this, proof that. And at some point, I mean, I remember I got a science degree. My degree's in chemistry, right? And my fourth year doing physical chemistry, which is gnarly. It's quantum mechanics in the chemistry department, right? And we had to present on a lab. We did. And the physical chemistry labs are just beyond complicated. You just get like this mountain of data and they're like, have fun, figure it out. Spent a lot of overnighters in the chemistry computer lab. But I'm doing this presentation and it was on first and second order reaction rates. And I said, well, we did the experiment, and here's the data, and here's the equation, and blah, blah, blah. So this proves that this was a first-order reaction. And my professor, who I did not like, this was the one thing he said to me that I remember basically forever. He said, no, you can't prove anything. You can only disprove stuff. And I was like, oh, okay. But I think as a culture, we've really lost that, right? That kind of the whole idea behind logic in science is that we can never conclusively say that this is what's actually going on. We can show that that's definitely not what's going on, but we can't conclusively say that this is what's going on. And this obsession with, you have to prove that this is exactly the thing that's going on. Well, by the definition I just gave, or the example I just gave, that's impossible. So I'm thinking about what you just said is, in a certain sense, the West needs to get over that. Am I hearing you correctly?
100%, and I think it's important to know, like, it's neurotic. It's actually an intellectual neuroses, I think, because it actually doesn't make sense of the world very well, right? Because all the things that have meaning in your life, aesthetic experience, moral experience, love, religious experience, like none of these things
go into a test tube. Right?
You have to relegate them to the subjective and therefore the meaningless or the unimportant on a scientific worldview. And so just from a basic zoomed out scientific perspective, to me that says we are going to throw out 90% of the data of human experience because it doesn't fit the model. And unfortunately, and unfortunately, well, because it doesn't fit the model. And it's like, well, maybe the model's bad. And, the problem is that this has been done by many scientists for the last several hundred years. I mean, Louis Pasteur could not, we found out about this in his journals after he died, he couldn't actually demonstrate the germ theory of disease in a laboratory setting. He tried everything. We won't go into that, but I think that's really interesting. Gregor Mendel famously threw out data that didn't fit the Mendel charts or whatever. So it's like the pepper moth experiment was faked. I mean, there's so many instances where it's like the scientific community has not really behaved with the integrity that it claims for its methodology, first of all. But second of all, like, what's going on with the scientific revolution? Why did we get this way? And the answer is complicated, but one of the dimensions is we really didn't want to assume first principles at all. Like, we wanted to do ground up instead of top down, So the ancients and the medievals are like, okay, the universe is like this, premise, cosmology, religion, worldview. So now let's go down from there to see how all of the data fits into that model.
God created everything and he told us this, therefore we could start with that sort of.
Yeah, that's
or the gods did, or whoever. Well, yeah,
exactly. Whatever your mythology is right, and that's a top-down way of approaching the universe. And you're bringing meaning into it as a lens to understand what's happening in the world. Whereas you might say that the Newtonian revolution was something like refusing to do any of that and starting from the bottom. I have
something to say on the Newtonian revolution after you're done. Continue.
Yeah, bottom up. So it's like, let's just look at the data and then extrapolate up to the first principles. And that was tried. I just think that methodology has failed. It's failed to provide, like, it's succeeded in producing all this dumb technology that's horrible for us, obviously. Yes, there are metrics for success that people want to try out, but I think that's too unidimensional a way of looking at it. Like, that methodology has failed to give meaning to our world. It's created a world of nihilism. It's like we have this Western culture. You were just saying, I'm so grateful that I live in this world where there's generally peace in North America. People aren't killing each other randomly. Yeah. There's not violent insurrections every year.
There's not bombs falling from the sky.
When I wake up, I can turn the heater on when it's cold, and I turn on a knob and hot water comes out. It's like, whoa, that's kind of nuts. However, and you have technology that gives you whatever you want to see all of the time. Okay, within that milieu, guess what? Mental health, anxiety epidemic. Anxiety, depression. Like, people are talking about how we're in a mental health epidemic right now. Why is that happening when we're at the, close, well, I know at some reasonable metric, this is the most material prosperity we've had in a long time. Or let's say the last 100 years has hit that at some point. It's like something is missing here, and it's meaning. And everyone's talking about, anyone in any of these podcast circles knows this, but I'm specifically trying to implicate or to call the scientific community to task for like maybe reductive materialism, where you are just a biological robot with no free will, no personhood in a meaningless universe. Maybe that's not a great worldview.
And maybe you don't actually believe it. Sorry to interrupt you. This kind of hit a pet peeve of mine. Is that what I don't believe anybody who argues for determinism.
Sure.
I mean, whether they're conscious of it or not, is that fundamentally, I think anybody who argues for determinism is attempting to manipulate you, whether directly or that they don't want to be held accountable for their actions. Because if there is no such thing as free will, then you're not responsible for anything. Right? And anybody who argues determinism, I want to test this. Normally, these conversations happen over virtual methods, right? But if I'm able to have this conversation with somebody in person and someone starts arguing determinism, I just want to take their wallet.
Just hit them.
Walk off with it, right? And then when they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, what do you mean, what am I doing? Well, you're taking my wallet. I'm like, well, I can't be responsible for it. It's just, the nature of balls bouncing around and, why do you care? It's just what's happening. Right?
Same thing for people who argue that there's no such thing as morality.
Correct. But yes. But on this free will one in particular, and I don't believe the people who argue that there's no such thing as morality believe in it either. I think it's just a way of manipulating. But for addressing the scientific community, supposedly in particular, this idea that, okay, we're just a bunch of balls bouncing around and there's no such thing as free will, they will immediately try to hold you responsible for something if you do something bad to them, so they don't believe it. So quit purveying it onto me. Sorry, pet peeve button that you.
Oh no, of course,
there, yeah.
And I think that's a proper reaction because when somebody is like a big arrogant jerk all of the time and then they get something wrong, everybody wants to dunk on them. It's just kind of human nature. And I guess I feel like the scientific community since the scientific revolution has been such a triumphalist movement, and it's been so strident in its massive claims about its superiority as a methodology and a worldview. And there's like, it needs to answer for things like nuclear bombs. It needs to answer
poison gas. Those were the two things I was thinking. We invented poison gas and nuclear bombs. You may worship us now. Okay. Yeah.
Like World War II is the whole 20th century, really. Like, yes, there's a lot of material prosperity. Also, the most people killed ever in I think it's the most people died in the 20th century than all previous centuries combined. And I don't think that that's a population issue necessarily. I think that no other time in history did we see technological advances so completely funneled into, and wealth and civilian activity funneled into murder. Like that was just every country who did, like our country, the Soviets, the Germans, the British, like we've got to kill them all as efficiently as possible.
Yeah.
It's like, anyway, that's a whole different topic.
Yeah, that is. We're getting kind of long here, so I'll try to wrap this up. But just going back to Isaac Newton, are you familiar with the guy, Dr. E. Michael Jones?
I'm not.
Okay. I've interviewed him here. He's a Catholic guy. He wrote a book on it's supposed to be a critique on the history of usury versus labor.
Okay.
Very economic, but his argument is that economics is actually a moral science. For maybe that's the term he used, but you have to address economics morally, or else you end up with crap. And he writes this whole book arguing that, and he actually has a couple chapters on Isaac Newton, because one thing that Isaac Newton did, he argues, is that he took the telos out of the universe. Because this is fascinating. I don't know if you knew this. Isaac Newton was an alchemist, like seriously into alchemy, right? Like when they found his library after he died, like 60% of the books were alchemy books or something like that. And they posthumously took a sample of his hair and tested it for mercury, and he had like 40 times the amount of mercury that most people did because they were obsessed with mercury for alchemy, right? And Dr. Jones' argument is that Isaac Newton was into, I'm going to not remember the Greek guy's name. Euripides? Started with an E. An alchemist from like 800 BC or something that made the argument that all reality is the working out of love versus strife. That it's this tension between love versus strife. And all Isaac Newton did was rename strife inertia and rename love gravity. And that the universe exists as this tension of gravity and inertia. And so because it's that, there doesn't need to be any meaning. There doesn't need to be any telos. And that everything could just run on its own. And this was, like you were pointing out, there was kind of this basis of the scientific revolution that really came out of Isaac Newton. And I mean, I'm not trying to dunk Isaac Newton into the garbage and say like he was this horrible person that didn't do anything useful. But what was extrapolated from that is we don't need God to explain the universe anymore. But because there's this alchemical principle between love and strife that keeps the universe going is essentially the argument. And then Dr. Jones takes it on to say that Adam Smith's economic arguments were his attempt to make a physics out of economics in the same way that Isaac Newton did. So instead of love and strife or gravity and inertia, you had competition and free market, I think were the two. With competition and what was the other one? Whatever. It was taking the same principle to try to take the telos out of economics as well. But just to the point, going back to Isaac Newton and to the scientific revolution, is I think Dr. Jones made a very interesting point here that Isaac Newton was able to take the telos out of understanding the universe, which sounds scientific until you realize his argument for it was alchemy, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to scandalize people with how much the founders of the modern scientific revolution were obsessed with alchemy, and it's been suggested by people like C.S. Lewis that alchemy and science, as we understand it today, really have the same telos, which is to dominate nature. And the impulse is the same, that man must dominate and control nature. And alchemy, for various reasons, didn't end up working, and science ended up working better. And so that's the one that takes the victory in history. But it's like the impulse is the same, which is to conquer, to conquer nature, which is a very different relationship than to bring it all the way back around, than the original kind of Christian understanding, which is that Adam is made as the gardener. He's the steward of nature. He's supposed to grow it and cultivate it. Even before the fall, the text of Genesis says that there's work to do. God puts Adam in the garden to cultivate it. So he wants us to continue the act of creation, to subcreate. That's what Tolkien talked about, to be co-creators with God, to share in his production of the world. But in the absence, being disconnected from God, in the absence of being holy and walking with God, we have instead perverted that towards control and power and the rape of nature. I mean, this is how some of these people talked about it. So, something I always used to say in class was, the problem isn't knowledge. We have so much knowledge and information and power. People are like, oh, well, people are just stupid. That's the problem with stuff. It's like, no, we do a lot of things. The problem is we're immoral. I mean, we don't have a moral center. We don't have a moral grounding, so we need to recover holiness and the virtues in order to wield this power and technology and science well. Otherwise, we're just going to do what we did in the 20th century with it again, and who knows? Now we're doing it in a soft way, with the phone. So that's maybe a good kicking off point to think about what do we really need? Like what's our journey to reality? That's why I named the book this, because you're not real yet, and you have to have the humility to accept that you're not real, that you don't need more information. You don't need more power. you need to be good.
Dr. Porcu, is there a question that I didn't ask that you wish I did?
That's a really interesting question. No, this was great. I think we covered a lot of different topics that I wasn't expecting to cover. I enjoyed it immensely.
Good. That's always one of my goals, is unexpected. If somebody wants to check out your material, obviously here's the book, Journey to Reality. I'm guessing you don't want them to buy it on Amazon because they don't give you any money. Very little money if they do it that way. If they get more, if you get it off your website.
It doesn't matter. It's all the same. I don't get, publishing does not make that much money. Don't worry about it. Amazon's convenient. It's on Amazon. It's on Ancient Faith's store. It's fine. If you want to follow my content, people keep bugging me to put more stuff on my YouTube channel. I think that's coming soon. There's a big project in the works that we'll probably be launching in a couple months here that I'm excited about, but I'm not allowed to say anything about that. Okay. So if people are interested, you can go to my website, which is just kind of where I collect all of these links at zacharyporcu.com. And if you just sign up to be notified when cool stuff happens, then I'll let you know. I don't have a weekly mailer or anything like that. Yeah, you can, there it is. So yeah, your video is going to go up there too.
Heck yeah.
So yeah, just sign up and I'll let you know when the big project is coming. But there should be more stuff on YouTube and really cool things coming up. But thanks for asking.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on. This has been Dylan with iRead TV and Dr. Zachary Porcu, or Zach Porcu, you got written there. And I hope I can bring you on again at some point, because this has been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, no, it's been great. I feel like we didn't even cover half of the stuff we brought up.